Guardians of the B.L.A.D.E. by Adalene Martis. Chapter 8. Confession. Over the next couple weeks, Nyra and Therak got most of the air circulation, purification, and oxygen generation systems back in the green, restoring life support throughout the rest of the facility. Therak was very happy to sleep in his own bed again. One afternoon, Therak decided to show Nyra the broken fan in his quarters. "Think you might be able to do something with this?" he asked, gesturing toward the silent, dust-covered device mounted on the wall. Nyra examined the fan thoughtfully. "I can sure try. Need my tools, though." He nodded, fetching the tools she requested. Handing them over, he said, "I'll leave you to it, then. Going to make us some lunch." As he prepared the meal, Therak couldn't help but reflect on how much things had changed. Allowing her into his personal space alone was a significant step for him. He found himself humming softly, a habit he thought he'd lost over the years. When the food was ready, he carried the plates back to his quarters. Upon entering, he immediately noticed the gentle whir of the fan overhead. A cool breeze circulated the air, making the room feel fresher and more inviting. "Lunch is ready," he announced. "Just a moment," Nyra replied, her back turned to him as she sat at his desk, tools spread out before her. He stood by the door, curiosity piqued. "Thanks for fixing the fan. It already smells less stuffy in here." She murmured, clearly engrossed in whatever she was working on. He stepped closer, trying to look over her shoulder. "What are you up to now?" She set down her tools and spun around to face him. "Done," she declared with a satisfied smile. In her hands, she held his old brush, the one he'd thought beyond repair. She had skillfully mended it using bands of metal and woven wire to replace the missing bristles. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Therak's eyes widened in surprise. "You fixed my brush?" She grinned. "It wasn't that hard," she said. "I just needed the right materials and a bit of patience." He was genuinely touched. "Don't undersell yourself. This couldn't have been easy. I don't know what to say. Thank you." She stood up and motioned toward a spot on the floor next to her chair. "Set the food down and sit down here," she said, obliging. He placed the plates on the table and sat at her feet. She approached his mane with the brush. His head was level with her chest. Nyra began to gently brush his mane. The long strokes untangled his knots and smoothed his disheveled hair. The sensation was incredibly soothing. Therak closed his eyes, allowing himself to relax under her attentive care. Without warning, a deep, resonant purr emanated from his chest. The sound startled them both. He couldn't remember the last time he had purred like that. "Sorry," he mumbled, a bit embarrassed. "We should eat before your food gets cold." Nyra glanced over at the untouched plates. "Meat for me and paste for you again?" He nodded. "The meat will run out before long. Enjoy it while you can." He began to rise, but she placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Hold on. Let me finish first. I'm tired of looking at this mangled mane of yours." "But your food will get cold," he protested. She chuckled softly. "It can wait. Besides, I'm enjoying this." She continued brushing, occasionally running her fingers through his hair to smooth it out. Every so often, she leaned in to nuzzle or gently lick his mane. The combination of her actions was both relaxing and intimate. Therak felt the urge to purr rising again and tried to suppress it, his cheeks warming under his fur. "Therak, it's okay," she assured him. "If you want to purr, then purr." He hesitated, but then allowed himself to let go. The purr started softly, a gentle rumble that grew in depth and volume. The vibrations resonated through his chest, filling the room. The furniture around them began to tremble slightly, and the plates on the table clinked and rattled. "Whoa!" Nyra exclaimed, amusement dancing in her eyes. A mischievous look crossed her face as she shifted her position, straddling his shoulder with her legs and sitting on his broad muscles. "Oh ho ho, yeah." As she began undulating her hips in little waves, he glanced up at her in surprise. Inhaling deeply, his lips pulled back as her pheromones hit him. "You're in heat already?" he asked, his voice modulated by his vibrant purr. "Seems that way," she said. "You're enjoying this a bit too much," he said. "Can you blame me?" she replied, resuming her brushing. "Don't stop." Therak furrowed his brow. They had been lucky she hadn't gotten pregnant during her last heat. He was a little worried, but if she was only having fun on his shoulder, then there was no harm, right? He closed his eyes, surrendering to the moment. The rhythmic strokes of the brush, combined with her occasional kisses, lulled him into a state of peaceful contentment. It had been so long since he'd felt this connected to someone. Time passed as she continued to rub herself on him, until she eventually gave up the brushing and clutched his head tightly, focusing on grinding on his shoulder with her hips. Modulating his voice, he purred as loudly as he could until her body shuddered, then grew still. After her muscles relaxed, she set the brush aside and rested her head against his. "There, much better," she declared. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I didn't realize how much I needed that." "Thank me? No, thank you," she said. "Your purr is amazing." Therak felt his face heat up with embarrassment. They sat together in comfortable silence, the tension of days past, replaced by an easy camaraderie. Eventually, Therak remembered the meals waiting for them. "We should probably eat now," he suggested. Nyra nodded. "Agreed. I'm starting to get hungry." They moved to the table and began their lunch. As they ate, their conversation flowed easily, discussing everything from the peculiarities of the facility to stories of their past experiences on different worlds. Laughter punctuated their exchanges, each finding joy in the other's company. Therak continued to refuse to mate with Nyra during her heat, though he did help her relieve tension during the first few days. When her brain was burned to the point that she began trying to smear her juices on his muzzle, he locked her in his room so that she'd have access to food, water, and a bathroom while he went without. After the most dangerous days had passed and her heat was winding down, Therak let her free, only to get the most hateful look he'd ever seen in his life. "Don't ever lock me up like that again," she demanded. "I'm a person, not a wild animal." "You were in heat," he began. "So, aren't you supposed to be making me happy? You swore you'd treat me the best you possibly could. Does fair and honor mean nothing?" she said with her arms crossed. He tried explaining how her getting pregnant would be bad, but she ignored him. In the end, he gave up trying to argue with her and nodded along with every emotional argument she made until she was satisfied. Once that was done, and he'd cleaned up the mess she'd made on his bed, he could finally bring up what he'd wanted to discuss all along: their next big project. He needed her input. Therak showed Nyra more of the facility's inner workings, pointing out where the problems lay. After careful consideration, they both decided that restoring water to the entire facility was priority one. Since he couldn't fit into the smaller spaces of the facility, he had to entrust her with the task, helping where he could. In return, she rooted around until she found a broken pump, which she disassembled herself and cleverly managed to fix. Nyra continued to impress him. Her explanations were concise and simple to understand, and she was generous with praise, leaving him feeling needed. Her manner was so unassuming that he didn't mind her taking the lead. This was exactly how a competent leader should behave. She reminded Therak of his king. The king had espoused the use of gentle power to motivate where possible, rather than dominating through using hard power. Nyra epitomized this form of leadership better than any officer Therak had met. Repairing the pump was just part of the problem. They had to test all along the lines, repairing leaks and looking for clogs. It would have been frustrating, but with Nyra by his side, Therak was enjoying maintenance tasks for the first time in his life. He found solace in shared moments, a lingering glance, a shared joke, the simple act of working side by side. Therak came to deeply admire her. He had never met a more impressive feline. He found himself wishing he had met her when he was younger and somewhere other than the facility. On the evening of their successful completion of the plumbing project, Therak wanted to celebrate. He remembered Nyra saying she loved the stars, so he took her to see the sunset. They stood together outside, the Arctic breeze of the frozen planet blowing over them as a distant blue star lit the sky. Its light barely provided any warmth, but during sunset it cast the world in a beautiful blue glow. This is exactly what he had wanted to show her. As Nyra's eyes lingered on the stars above them, Therak stared at her. He was in awe of her beauty. Even disguised as she was behind her cold weather gear and oxygen mask, he found himself reaching for her hand. As his hand grazed hers, she gripped it without hesitation and met his eyes. Therak began breathing heavily, his warm breath fogging his mask until he was hardly able to see anything. "Where'd you go?" he said, deadpan. Nyra giggled, her amusement ringing like bells, which lifted Therak's heart. "Should we go inside?" she asked. "I suppose," said Therak. "This way," she said, guiding him with her hand. He heard the door to the facility open. As they stepped into the airlock, Nyra guided Therak toward the entrance. "Duck," she said, but before he could react, Therak misjudged the doorway's height and jerked with pain as he smacked his head hard against the metal frame. "Ow," he said, rubbing the sore spot. Nyra couldn't help but chuckle. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes dancing with amusement. "That's what happens when you're as tall as a tree," she said. He gave her a sheepish grin. The door slid shut behind them as they entered the equipment closet, the place where all the EVA gear was kept. They removed their oxygen masks and thick coats, carefully stowing them in their designated compartments. Therak rubbed his head and felt a lump rising. "You okay?" she asked again. "I'll be fine. Just killed my last few brain cells," Therak remarked, attempting to laugh off his mishap. Nyra glanced at him, a hint of concern in her expression. "Let me look at your head. I want to make sure you didn't hurt yourself too badly." He waved a dismissive hand. "It's just a bump. Nothing to worry about." She arched an eyebrow. "Humor me," she said. "It's the least I can do after you took me stargazing." He hesitated but then nodded. "All right." She led the way to her quarters, and he followed, the corridors quiet, except for the soft hum of the facility's systems. Upon reaching her room, he opened the door for her and she walked in first, then gestured for him to enter. "Have a seat," she said, pointing to a spot on the floor beside her bed. He sat down as she settled on the edge of the bed, her eyes focused on examining his injury. Gently, she parted the fur near the spot where he'd hit his head. "Here?" she asked, touching the tender area lightly. He nodded. "Yeah, that's it." Without warning, she leaned in and gave the spot a soft lick. The warmth of her touch sent a subtle thrill through him. "Still hurt?" she asked, a playful note in her voice. "A little," he replied, his heartbeat starting to quicken. She leaned in again. This time her tongue moved slower, the gesture lingering and filled with intention. "How about now?" she whispered, her voice carrying a seductive undertone. His lips pulled back as he caught her scent. She was going into heat yet again. It was faint, but it was there. Therak felt his cheeks warm, a purr beginning to build in his chest. The growing feeling that he'd been suppressing for the past couple weeks powerfully surfaced. It was obvious she was still manipulating him, but he didn't care anymore. In the relatively short period since she'd arrived, he'd known more joy than he had in the past 30 years combined. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't help how he was feeling. "Nyra," he began, his voice barely audible. She murmured, her eyes locking onto his as she leaned in once more. "I love you," he confessed, the words escaping before he could second-guess himself. For a moment, she hesitated, a complex array of emotions crossing her face. He looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm sorry, I know I don't have the right to." She gently placed a finger against his muzzle, silencing him. "Stop talking," she said softly. With graceful ease, she leaned forward and closed the distance between them. Therak felt the world narrow to just the two of them as she embraced him, all his doubts fading away.